It's a delight to be here with you. It took me a lot of time to get here, I want to tell you, 24 hours on the planes and waiting in airports and so forth. But here I am, and I'm alive and kicking. So I was asked today to talk about a special thing that I've developed over the years, which is to teach students how to do textual analysis, but to use learning games to help them do so. So let me draw a couple of charts. Incidentally, I'm from Boston, so I don't pronounce my R's. So most Americans would say chart. I say chart. It's sort of English nature in any case. So the first chart I want to show you is, here we have the text. It could be a television program, it could be a film, it could be a commercial, an advertisement, or it could be something broader, a sitcom, which went for 5 years. Or I wrote a book on Jewish humor, which has gone on for a long time. So there are many different texts, and you always have the problem of deciding how to deal with that text. But to make life simple for us, let's assume we're talking about a television commercial or a film or a television program. Then there are a number of different ways in which we can look at that text. In my book, for example, I talk about semiotics. That's one approach to analyzing texts. Then I talk about sociological analysis. Uses and gratifications, and talk various aspects of social phenomena relative to text. Then there's psychoanalytic. Freud's notions, of which I'm particularly fond, which gets me into a lot of trouble because so many people find Freud crazy, but that's beside the point. And then there's Marxist. Or we could say ideological. And there could be others, feminist. There could be ethicist, ethical critics. That is the point I'm making, is there are many different ways, many different approaches to interpreting texts, right? And every person who interprets text does so on the basis of certain beliefs that they have, certain values, certain notions, and certain ideas they have about which is the best techniques. Or we could have a combination of the techniques. Thus, for example, what we call cultural studies generally uses semiotics, psychoanalytic, and Marxist techniques. Depending on different aspects of the text, you analyze it semiotically, you analyze it psychoanalytically, you analyze it from a Marxist perspective, and so forth. I understand that Marxism is not taught here as a rule. In America, we have a lot of Marxists. This does not mean we believe in revolution and we want to overthrow the government. This means we want to use Marxist concepts to help understand the media and the role that, the role that they have. Okay. So here's the problem. You teach students a semester of semiotics, and you say to them, make a semiotic analysis of something. They don't have the slightest idea what to do. I came across this a couple of years ago when I was in Argentina. I was also on a Fulbright senior specialist there for a month. And time and time again, the professors would say to me, we've taught the students a semester of semiotic theory, they don't know what to do with it. And the reason they don't know what to do with it is because you have to teach them step by step how to use certain aspects of semiotic theory. And that's where the games come in, you see. So last night I was thinking about how to explain this to you, and I came up with a diagram. I love diagrams and charts and things like that. So here is here's the way, here's semiotics theory. Here is the text. So this is like stairs. Well, the jump from here to here is too great for them. They cannot do it. So what I have done with my games is put in a lot of learning games as we go along. So this would be, here's the text. So if they've had practice learning certain things, certain aspects of semiotic theory and applying them to different texts and parts of text or whatever it is, then they're able to take semiotic theory and use it with a text. So the example I gave was, let's see, I developed a number of semiotic games. One is what I call the signified game. And what I do is I have a chart, actually in the back of this book, I have a lot of games. What I do is I give them a chart, and on that chart are things like secret agent. That's my persona, the secret agent. I once wrote an article. It was like 30 pages long. The editor cut out the first 20 pages, and the third section was called the secret agent, and that is how I became a secret agent. So I say secret agent, and then the secret agent is the signified. What are the signifiers of a secret agent? You see. And then I did love, Frenchness. I could do Belarusness, whatever Belarusness is. But the point I'm trying to make is that with this little exercise, students start recognizing signifiers and signifieds. They've been given the signified, and so they have to figure out what the signifiers are. So we do, traditionally we do France, we do hate, love, alienation. There's a whole bunch of things that they do in little teams of 3. As a result of that exercise, they're more alert to what signifiers are and what signifieds are. So we had a little textual analysis earlier, and the students found one signifier and they let it go at that. They should have 10 or 15 signifiers and show how those signifiers relate to what's happening in the text. Okay. So I had the signified game, right? What are the signifiers of a secret agent? Dark glasses, so that you can look at other people and they can't see what you're looking at. Often with trench coats and slouch hats, so they sort of can't really see them very well. And guns with silencers. Because if you're a secret agent, you want to kill someone. Like when I'm a secret agent, suppose I want to kill one of you. I wouldn't want to make a big loud noise so other people would hear. Psst, and the person is dead. So the silencer makes a very good silence. You following? Are you following me? Did anyone have any problems up to this point? Okay, good. Okay. So what was the next? What was the next thing I had? Oh, okay, metaphor. So the next exercise is metaphor. I have a metaphor game. I give the students a metaphor, and I ask them to see how that metaphor reflects about life. You see. Supposing I gave you the metaphor, love is a fever. What does that tell you about love?
It's a disease.
What?
It's a disease.
It's a disease.
Maybe contagious.
Maybe contagious, but also it can be cured. Yeah, see, it can be cured. So now, if you're familiar with semiotic analysis, it says there's two basic approaches. One is called syntagmatic analysis, and the other is paradigmatic analysis. Syntagmatic analysis looks at the narrative structure. It comes from Vladimir Propp. The word syntagm means chain. So it's the chain of events that go on in the story, and how what happens this part of the event, in the story affects that part of the story, right? So we play a little game. I give them some text. For example, there's a wonderful text by a psychiatrist named Robert Lifton about the Japanese. And in the text, he talks about how some Japanese are wet and some Japanese are dry. The wet Japanese are old-fashioned. They cling to the old traditions. The dry Japanese are hip. They color their hair and all that kind of stuff. When reading that passage, the students are able to make a chart, wet and dry, and see different aspects of the Japanese culture as Lifton explains it. You see? So that means they become aware of oppositions. But when you do a paradigmatic analysis, this comes from Levi-Strauss's ideas, you must make sure that you deal with important things, not unimportant things. Like we had a little exercise with the students, and I asked them to make a paradigmatic analysis of this episode of The Prisoner. And some people said, well, there were carts in it that were slow and carts that were fast. It's absolutely irrelevant. What's important in this was the opposition between the prisoner as an individual fighting this authoritarian society in which he is thrown. So you have to learn to be a little bit careful about the kind of oppositions you make. There are some oppositions in the text that are irrelevant, but you were looking for important oppositions that give the text its meaning, because remember, the notion is that syntagmatic analysis tells you what happens in the text. Paradigmatic analysis tells you what a text means. Okay? So if you want to know what it means, you have to look at the set of oppositions. And this sort of comes from Saussure, who said concepts have meaning only in the sense that they're opposite of something else. They don't have any meaning in themselves. Right? So what that means is when a person watches a television program or an advertisement or whatever it is, unconsciously, they're looking for oppositions that give everything meaning. You see. Somebody's facial expression, what does it mean? Well, they have to look at it in terms of the context of what's happening and so forth and so on. So we do little sort of exercises. They learn to recognize signifiers and signifieds of importance. Always, in all cases, you always tie whatever you're dealing with to things that happen in the text. See? It's the text that you use to sort of generate all of these things, not just the notion that there are signifiers and just of secondary importance. So you're looking for things in the text. So they learn how to identify signifiers. They learn the notion of metaphors and how metaphors play a role in our understanding what life is all about and things like that. They learn how to do polar oppositions. The point is, I've developed a number of games. I think I could actually show them in this book. I've actually written a book just on games, learning with games, and I've supplied you basically with most of it. Yeah. So, but in the back of this book, lately, in all of my books, I have games. So I have different charts and diagrams and games for the students to play, to apply what they've learned in the first section to text. So this is an example, like from semiotic theory, of how you use games to teach them so they can make a better semiotic analysis of a text. If you just give them the text, they're lost. You see, and that's why when I was in Brazil, not in Argentina, they were resistant to playing games and to doing things other than talking about theory. Why? Professors like to talk about theory. Theory is fun, it's like philosophy and so forth and so on. So I played a game with them, and it's a game that I played here. Yes, do you have a question? Yeah.
I remember you gave a very interesting example connected with syntagmatic analysis, and that is Propp's analysis of a fairy tale.
Yes.
Just could you specify syntagmatic analysis?
Yes. Well,
an example of fairy tale analysis and fairy tale writing.
Yes, it's actually Propp. In fact, this is one of the exercises I have in my book, to make a syntagmatic analysis of a text. This comes from the work of Vladimir Propp, whose book on folk tales sort of gives us the picture. He comes up with 45 different, 30 different functions of characters in the text. They're all actually in here. I have a chart. I've written this book so many times. I'm just hoping they don't make me do it again for a while. But I have I'm looking to see if I have my chart of Vladimir Prop. Somewhere in there I've sort of simplified it, and I also point out that Prop's notions have to be sort of updated. The example I would give you is I've made an analysis of James Bond stories. Well, in James Bond stories, in Prop, they get married and live happily ever after. In Bond, he gets to sleep with this beautiful girl, Honeychild Ryder, or whatever her name is. So you have to make an adaptation, but you can use Prop's functions to see certain things. As a matter of fact, it's a good test to show the students a text, to explain Prop's theories, give them, I'm looking to see if I have the chart here, it's somewhere around here. Oh, here it is right here. So I have, unfortunately they put it on 2 pages, because it's a little long, but I have the 45 Prop's 45 functions. I then say, look at this text and see if you can do 6 or 8 of them that are of significance. For example, I showed an episode of The Prisoner to some students in this class, and I asked them to make a Propian analysis. And they had some trouble, but they all got one important thing, that there was a gift, a donor gave a gift to the prisoner. Well, that's right out of Prop, you see. So what you learn is that the prisoner is in many respects a fairy tale. See? It's a modernized fairy tale. Then I could go, I'll give you a couple of examples of psychoanalytic. Does anyone have any questions about this while I've got it on the board? Yes?
Do you have just 3 types of games or 4 types of games when you come from semiotic theory to the text analysis?
I have a few games that I play for semiotics. See, this book is divided. I wrote this book because when I started teaching popular culture and media, most of the way is usually taught by somebody reading a big book full of essays by professors. You learn, what did this professor say? The test is, what did this professor say? You write it down, you get an A, and it doesn't mean anything to you. My innovation was teach a methodology. If you teach a methodology to people, it gets into their heads and it never goes away. So I know that I've turned out quite a few semioticians who, once they've learned this semiotics, they start seeing the world in a little different way. In fact, I had one student, I hadn't seen her for 20 years. I was in the supermarket, and she saw me, and she came up to me and said, "Oh, Professor Berger, how are you?" and all that kind of stuff. And she said, "You know, that course in semiotics," because I used to teach seminars in semiotics too, "that course in semiotics is still with me. This is 20 years ago." Because what happens is your mind starts seeing the world a little different way. You start seeing the world in terms of signifiers and signifies and all of that kind of thing. So in this book, what I did is I have my 4 different techniques: semiotics, Marxist, psychoanalytic, and sociological. Then in the second part of the book, I have applications, in which I show the students how I can apply semiotic theory to football games and Murder in the Orient Express, and use other techniques too. So in each of these, in the second part of the book, I use many different theories to explain a given text. You see, but it's when I say many different, I use like semiotics, Marxist, psychoanalytic, and social. So this then shows them how it can be used. But then the games are important because then it's one thing to read about it; it's another thing to do it. And the thing I've noticed about when the students are playing games is they actually become involved. They talk a lot. They become excited sometimes. They fight. Some students are not used to cooperative behavior, so they have to have their way or no way. So all of these things are kind of important. I'll give you another example on psychoanalytic theory. And incidentally, this is the games book that I did. And in it I have a list of learning with games, and I explain why learning with games is important. Because when you're actually doing something, it's a little different than having a sort of abstract knowledge spoken to you and so forth and so on. So I have some rather strange games, but in any case, I have some psychoanalytic games. So let's assume you have played my games. You played the signifier-signified game. You played the metaphor game. You know that love is a fever and what the implications of that are. You've done a polar opposition of some text. What this means now is you have 3 or 4 techniques that you sort of understand how they work, and when you come to make a semiotic analysis of a text, you can apply them. You understand that? Okay. So, let's move on to Mr. Freud.
Do I have a question?
Yes, of course.
We analyze an Australian text.
Yes?
We analyze an Australian text.
Yes.
We're doing semiotic analysis.
Yes.
And you ask somebody, well, you meet a woman for the first time, and you ask somebody who has known her for a while
Yes.
to describe her to you. And this person says, hey, no, she's a cat. What's your take on it?
She's a what?
A cat.
A cat. Well, it may have something to do with Australian slang or something like that. No? No. I don't know what my take is on it because I know in America when we say a woman is a cat, it has certain meanings. Yeah.
Which is?
She may be a little sexually active and things like that. Yeah. Well, this is part of cultural analysis. You see, when you're doing semiotic analysis, that's one of the basic ways of studying cultures. Culture is a collection of signs and codes. Basically, that's what they are. I wrote a book called The Culture Code. What I point out is you can define cultures as a collection of codes. I'll give you an example. There's also a very interesting book, if you're interested in cultures and the difference between cultures. There's a very interesting book called The Code, something like that, by a French psychoanalyst and marketer. And what he points out is every culture has different codes. What happens is children between the ages of 1 and 7 are imprinted with the codes of that culture. You see? The rest of their life, they're going to be acting out those codes. You see? For example, he gives the example of cheese. In American culture, cheese is considered dead. So we wrap it in plastic and put it in what he called the morgue, the refrigerator. In French culture, cheese is considered alive. So you put it in a cloche, and it just sits there and gets gooier and gooier and gooier, you see. It's a difference in values. It's just a difference in values, you see. So cultures are all sort of collections of codes, and those codes are also, one of the important aspects of semiotics is the notion of codes. What are the codes that are functioning in that text? For example, I showed an episode of The Prisoner. In The Prisoner, a secret agent resigns. He goes home, he's going to go on vacation, he's gassed. He wakes up, he's in the village, in this place called the village. He doesn't have a name anymore, they give him a number. And what you learn, the code in that village is the lower your number, the more important you are. You see. So he always deals with a number 2, but number 2 is often getting calls from a number 1, who we never really get to see. And number 6, as 6 is pretty high, because they're 50s and 60s and all kinds of things like that. So there's certain codes in that culture, in all the cultures. So let's move on to my friend Sigmund Freud. So, psychoanalytic theory. I have a couple of games that I play in psychoanalytic theory. I usually, when I'm teaching students, first of all, I talk about the notion of the unconscious, which many of them have never heard of. And I draw this diagram. It should go up here. Here's a boat. Here's So this is the way to represent Freud's notion of the unconscious. It's like an iceberg. The part that we see above the water is consciousness. That's what you're aware of. That is, let's say, 15%. Let's assume we're looking at an iceberg. I'm going to take a cruise when I get back from here, so I get some sun in Mexico. Somebody said, aren't you afraid of icebergs? No, not really. Then you have here, just the section, just if you look at the iceberg and look below the water for about 5 feet, you can see a little bit of the iceberg vaguely made out. That would be the subconscious, preconscious, whatever you want to call it. And then this is the unconscious. And the important thing to them I point out is that it is the unconscious which is the source of many things we do. Things somehow get into our unconscious and shape our behavior, you see. So a lot of advertising is meant at sort of stimulating certain things in the unconscious so that you will make a decision that seems rational but is really based on unconscious things, unconscious aspects of your psyche. Okay. So I talk about the unconscious, one of his things. Then he has another theory about the id, ego, and the superego. That is the human mind here we have a student. And his mind, according to Freud, is split between 3 forces: id, ego, and superego. And so I discuss Freud's notion about the id. It's teeming with all kinds of things. About the superego, how it's sort of the source of guilt and conscience. And how the ego, the poor ego, has this struggle between your id, which says, I want to do it now, I want it all now. There was a famous television program about where I live in Mill Valley called I Want It All Now. That is an id concept. See. The superego is saying, no, you don't. You'll be sorry if you do. That comes from religion and so forth and so guilt. So this is sort of the drives, sex, and all that kind of stuff. This is guilt. So in order to show how the id, ego, and superego may play a role in culture, I devised a little game. And in that game, I make a little chart. So I have id, ego, because I want them to start thinking about these phenomena as they apply to characters in plays and films and so forth, as they apply to culture. Are you familiar with Star Trek, the series Star Trek? Yes. So it has 3 main characters, right? Who are the 3 main characters? You don't know the names. Okay, doesn't matter. I'll tell you. Okay. So just for the fun of it, let's say I play this little game with them. So here's the topic. So we have Star Trek. For them to see that in certain texts, some characters are ego characters, some characters are superego characters, some characters are id characters, right? So let's say Scotty, he's the doctor, he's emotional, so let's give him an id. Who's a superego character in this? Does anyone? What? You get the wrong. Star Trek, not Star Wars.
No idea.
Captain Kirk. Captain Kirk. Which somebody once told me is very similar to Kirsch here, which means church. Right? So here we have the captain. He's the superego figure. He commands and do this, do that. So we have Scotty, who gets excited about things and all that kind of stuff. And now, who is the ego character? Are you familiar with this text? No, you're not familiar with the text. Oh, I thought you knew it. Oh, Spock, Mr. Spock. Now, Mr. Spock is an alien. Oh. How do we know he's an alien? Because there's a signifier that tells us he's an alien. He's got pointed ears. He's complete rationality, has no emotion. See. So semiotic comes in handy if you know what does a signifier an alien? Well, in this one, it's with Spock, it's pointed ears. The rest of them is perfectly, but you get these sort of pointed ears up here, and they're always asking him, and it's always he says that's not logical, that's logical, and so forth and so on. So they can see sort of that certain characters in texts have certain kinds of characteristics relative to Freud. The id characters, the ego characters, superego. But we can also apply this to other things. For example, let's take cities. Somebody tell me what is a good id city in America? Id.
In a city or over a city?
A city that is basically id dominated.
Yeah, something with gambling.
Gambling, sex, yes, what would that city be? Las Vegas.
So the superego will be Rome.
Yes, excellent. The Vatican City. Vatican City. Vatican City. Not Rome.
Not Rome.
Because Rome is where La Dolce Vita, the Dolce Vita, beautiful women, drinking, gambling, all kinds of stuff like that. Ursula Andress or whatever her name is. So for ego, we often discuss it, but I say a city like Boston, which has 60 universities. So if you have a city with 60 universities, basically it's an ego city. You see. If you're in Las Vegas, Las Vegas's motto is, what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. So you go to Las Vegas and you gamble away all your money, you screw around with women, etc., etc., but nobody's ever going to find out because what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. You know? So Boston, you could take other places. Minsk. Minsk. Since I'm here, we'll put Minsk in. Do something made of. You have some universities here and so forth and so on.
Just 16.
What?
Just 16.
Yeah, 16 universities. Well, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. The point is you can take any number of different categories. If you're interested in the culture, you could take books. So, and find what would be the superego book. Bible. Well, whatever you want. New Testament, Old Testament, whatever you want. Maybe the Quran too. I don't know. Right. What would be an id, a book? One of these women's romances. You know, there's a lot of, in America, a lot of women read these romances. Some tall, handsome stud comes up on a horse and some beautiful woman is in need and so forth. So romances or love stories or, you know, any of that stuff. So. The point is, when the students play these exercises, they become involved with applying concepts to texts or to topics, whatever it is. But you, in every case, you must insist that they're always attaching whatever they're dealing with to someone or something that happens in the text. You just don't sort of spin this stuff around. Oh, there's a lot of alienation and so forth and so on. But you have to explain why there's alienation and so forth. For example, I sent some of the PhD students a chapter from this book on Marxist theory. And one of Marx's main concepts is alienation. So So if you're going to talk about it, you can say, well, there's a lot of alienation in the prisoner. Doesn't mean anything to me. You have to tell me where the source of that alienation is. So you must always be specific. That is a problem. Students tend to be very abstract. They touch a concept, but they don't want to deal with it and focus it on anything in particular. Right? So in any case, the point I'm making is that using these exercises is a way of first involving the students in activity, as opposed to sitting there and just listening. You know? And that tends to be rather deadly, you know, just listening, sitting there and listening. Nowadays, they're looking at their cell phones, and or they may have their laptops, and they're writing away. But what are they writing? Letters to their girlfriends or something like that. Not what you're talking about. So, I remember years ago, I was teaching this thing, and I was showing something, and I went to the back of the room, and somebody was writing away, and I happened to look at what he was passing to the girl. He said, "Come to my apartment tonight." So you have to be careful. You have to get these students involved in doing things as opposed to just sort of sitting there. It's not really a good way to teach. You know, we had a famous sort of nasty humorist named Ambrose Bierce, and he said, "A bore is someone who talks when you want them to listen." So what this does is it breaks up the sort of situation in which a professor is lecturing to students. I'm not saying that it isn't useful to do this at certain times, but it's also very useful to sort of use these different games so the students can learn how to sort of move from the theory to actually applying it to a text. All right, I'll open it up now for questions anyone has. Yes?
It's not so much a kind of a question, though it is. I know your books, I have read many of them, and I have found out that you have two steps in teaching interpretation. The first step is giving some technique, explaining the notion and applying this technique to the text analysis,
yes,
which the students read at that very time, and so text might be any text
yes,
they are doing,
right,
or even scenery they see.
Mm-hmm.
But that's one stage. Another stage is you ask students to produce their own texts using these techniques. And I remember a talk with you when you said about fairy tales.
Oh, yes.
The students in some countries are very, have a real trouble with suicides. And Latvia, Lithuania, and Belarus are on the top of the list of the world's suicide
11th.
countries.
You're 11th. You're only 11th.
Belarus is 11th. Lithuania is the 2nd. Latvia is the 10th. So the question was like that. So how your
another game. I have a game.
yes,
I have
how
a game.
your analysis can help students to solve their problems, which they have, and teachers need to know about
Yeah.
them.
I have a game that I play also. It's a really fun game, but you have to sort of know. I can only ask them to play the game after I've had lectured on psychoanalytic theory. So they learn about the Oedipus complex and castration anxiety and various things. So in this game, let's see if I can find it here. What I do is I take a notion from Bruno Bettelheim. He wrote a book called The Uses of Enchantment, which is about the importance of fairy tales in children's lives, and it turns out they're very important. And he mentions that in India there are certain fakers, or whatever you want to call them, wise men. And if a person who's troubled comes to that wise man then creates a fairy tale which is meant to solve the problems that person has. So the person that is instead of saying, you're an anal neurotic and so forth, the person says, I've written this fairy tale for you, ponder the fairy tale and it will help you deal with your problems, you see. So I have an analogy to that, an analog to that. I put the students in my groups of 3. Incidentally, I always put students in groups of 3. I have one person I describe as the scribe who does the writing, but that isn't, the writing is what everyone agrees on. The scribe contributes and the other people contribute. So I have these little groups of 3. In this particular episode, what I do, see if I can find it here. I have a list of, well, I'll eliminate this. Okay. I have a list of 5 people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and each team is given a different person. This person is obsessive, compulsive. This person is has let's see, but any number of different. He's obsessive compulsive. He has castration anxiety. Etc. I have this list, and on this, let's see if I can find it. No, I don't see it right here. Oh yes, therapeutic fairy tales. So I have this list, and so I tell this team 1, you're to deal with a character with these 5 or 6 problems. You're to write a fairy tale, a real fairy tale. Once upon a time, long, long ago, there was, and they have to have the conventions of a fairy tale. Children with simple names, John, Jack, Jill, whatever it is. And the story has to deal with these things, but not overtly. That is, if you have castration anxiety, you're afraid somebody's going to cut off your penis, right? You have to have a story in which somehow or another this problem is dealt with. He's afraid that he's going to lose his sword or something, but he gets it. You cannot say castration anxiety. You have to show it and then resolve it. So when they play this game, they're sort of being like that Indian faker. They're using psychoanalytic concepts, but they're creating a text, and the text has to cover, there's always like 5 different things that this person has. If I can find this, I'll give you an example. Right here. It's right here. So write a traditional fairy tale which starts as follows: once upon a time, long, long ago, and concludes, and they all lived happily ever after. Write in the past tense and include typical characters. Have the actions of the characters reflect and solve the numerous psychological problems with the person who's been assigned to you. And then in the bottom here I have one. This one has the Oedipus complex, castration, anxiety, and regression. The next one has penis envy, narcissism, and rationalization. So the point I'm making is, it's always a lot of fun to hear what the stories are like. But every time you play a game, it's not enough just to play the game. You have to have somebody, the scribe, come up to the blackboard and write down the numbers or whatever it is you're dealing with. And then you can sort of discuss them and see which ones seem to be more appropriate, which ones are off base, and so forth and so on. So that's a part of it that I should have emphasized more. So there's always a sort of class discussion after the game. Let's see. And then they can sort of see. And the nice thing about having a team is students by themselves are often afraid to say something because they think it's stupid or wrong or something like that. But if the person represents the team, you don't know who in the team had this idea. So if it's a stupid idea, well, you can say, well, the team had a stupid idea, but you're not saying this person had a stupid idea, and so they have a certain amount of anxiety reduced. You see. So, right. All right. Any other questions? Yes. Yes. No. She has a question back there. Yes.
Well, I have a question about these fairy tales, because actually these things you're describing, like castration, anxiety, and penis envy, are quite complicated things. So the student should be pretty well aware of.
It's India. The talk was about India.
No. She's right. But I explained to you.
You teach.
I teach it first.
Students.
Yes,
How much time do you spend on
it's there, and it's in the book, enough for them to know it.
How many hours? Like 10 classes?
No. Half of a class, 1 hour is enough. Yes. Yeah. Well, they read it all. They read it all. I give them a quiz on it to make sure they've read it. I give them a quiz to make sure they've read the material.
So that's like they do it
They read it. I give them a quiz and we discuss it. So at the
go over to teaching.
then I give them the game. Then I give them the game. You see, they can do it. I've done it. So I mean, it's not a matter of, you don't have to spend 10 hours teaching psychoanalytic theory to students. You know, you can outline the basic notions relatively quickly. You see, it's like any subject. You could go into it so deeply, you know, that you never get a time to play the games. I'm more interested in not so deeply, but time to play the games, because in the games they're applying the concepts that they're learning. If you spend all your time, I've spent 20 hours on psychoanalytic theory, it's an overkill. I would describe it as overkill. No, I've been doing this for many years, and I know that if they read there's like 25, 30 pages on psychoanalytic theory.
Is reading the book enough for?
Yes. Plus, we have to remember that not only do I have the first 4 chapters, semiotic, psychoanalytic, the second half of the book, I apply them so they can sort of see how you can apply these things too. Right. But it's a good question, because obviously you think, if they're going to write a fairy tale about psychoanalytic, about castration.
They're doing psychoanalytical work,
Yes,
actually,
yes.
to solve somebody else's problem.
Yes, to solve somebody else's problem, but what they're doing is it's all make-believe, isn't it? It's all make-believe, you see. What they're learning is how certain characters in texts may have certain psychological problems that you can sort of look at and recognize. The name of the game isn't just to have fun solving this imaginary person's psychoanalytic problems. The name of the game is to be able to recognize in characters certain kinds of problems.
So by producing their own text,
Yes.
students learn to see and interpret these things in other texts.
That's exactly what it's all about. That's the name of the game, right? It's not just a matter of having fun writing a crazy fairy tale in which somebody's worried about castration anxiety. No, it's being able to transfer that to text. Yes, okay.
Do you basically teach monocultural groups of students?
Not at all. At San Francisco State University, when I was there, we had students from many different cultures.
What traditional fairy
No, we had Asian children from Asia. We had people from Europe. We had all over the place. We had many different cultures. San Francisco in the school system in San Francisco teach 62 languages. So you have to realize San Francisco is not a monoculture at all. California has large numbers of Iranians, large numbers of Japanese, large numbers of Chinese. San Francisco has a very large Chinese population. A goodly number of my students were Chinese. And of course it was a bit of a shock to them when I start talking about things like castration anxiety, phallic symbols and things like that. As one student once said to me, it's a phallic symbol, but a phallic symbol of what? But she doesn't know anything about psychoanalytic theory, you see. No, this is all done in a half an hour. You put them into a team. I put them into a team. I take you 3, put you into a team. I say, your team has to do person number 4, fixation, castration, anxiety, and narcissism, right? You have half an hour to write the story, see. But remember, in writing the story, you cannot use the word fixation, you cannot use the word narcissism, and you cannot use the word castration anxiety. You have to show it. And the notion being that when you're playing around with these things, you then can sort of see it in other characters.